Hey, ladies and gentlemen, let's take a look at our last thematic section, and that is political participation. Political participation is people's involvement and influence in the political process. And there are different ways that different types of regimes go about this. It could be, depending on your type of regime, voluntary participation or coerced, which is manipulated participation. It could be support or against the system of government in power. We forget that, and most people think that protest is just, against something. It could actually be in support of something that the government is doing. There's different types of formal and informal pieces of political participation that we're going to be looking at. And in democratic regimes, usually participation exists because of depending on the legitimacy of the government. Do we believe you have the right to rule? Do we trust you? Has something happened? And that people feel a sense of efficacy, that their voice, their vote is actually having influence, that their voices are being heard, that kind of thing. So the combination of efficacy and legitimacy are the primary motivators of political participation in democratic regimes. So let's take a look at the examples of formal and informal participation. Formal participation includes elections, whether you're voting, running for office, working on a campaign or political party. This will be considered, your direct impact into um, impacting the political process. Referenda. These are laws passed by direct election of voters. When you have laws that are passed by voters, that's a formal form of political participation. And of course, personal contact, your ability to actually talk to, listen to, write letters to people that involved in politics, things like town halls or debates or things like that. Informal political participation is going to be protests and social movements. Whether it's physical or virtual, the act of protesting is a form of political participation in a regime. By the way, a protest, of course, is you're going out and actively protesting against something. A social movement is something much bigger, like overall society. You're seeing multiple protests over time, over an extended period of time. Also, you have civil society. Of course, these are groups not a part of the government with a political agenda. And political violence and terrorism. Is that good? No, not necessarily. But is it a form of informal democratic protest? It does happen, political violence and terrorism in democratic regimes. Now, in a democratic regime, you're more likely to have a pluralistic society where people join civil society, overall, like non-governmental organizations, labor unions, business, and you have a direct connect to people like the president or the legislative branch. You actually can influence members of the executive branch and members of the cabinet, depending on, of course, how big your influence is. But you can have a direct connection to the legislative branch. You can go into the office of your legislative member and talk to members of their staff directly. You don't have to go long routes around or have gatekeeping of that occurring. It's just how persistent you are to getting change done. Now, in political participation in a authoritarian regime is much more about control. It does kind of impact a little more of legitimacy, but it's also plays the part of a safety valve. Okay, it allows people to blow off steam so they're not doing something like thinking of a revolution, or they're thinking of terrorism or political violence or pushing back against the authoritarian regime. So yeah, legitimacy is still there. So is a sense of control, and of course, let people blow off a lot of stress and steam, so they'll peter out and not do something actually physical against the regime. So if we look at things that like parts of civil society in our authoritarian regimes, there are local elections, even though the CCP manipulates it and puts the people on the ballot for the National People's Congress. Protests are basically slammed down by the Great Firewall. Are you allowed to protest in China? You are. You just can't protest anything about the party. So if you're like labor or zero COVID or the environment, obviously party membership is part of political participation, and your civil society influence is really limited. Russia has elections, of course, but they're entirely manipulated. They're not free and fair. Protests that are supportive of the regime of the war in Ukraine, Nashi, the Russian Youth Army, where young people kind of are politically, controlled from a young age. Civil society is extremely limited and especially during the war now, it almost doesn't exist. Iran has elections for legitimacy, even though the Guardian Council manipulates them. There are protests, as we've seen with Masha Amini and the Green Movement. You have the merchant class, the Bazaris. That this is the kind of the middle upper class business leaders that have a lot of influence on what goes on in government. When the economy gets really bad, they start to rise up and complain, and things get done. Civil society does exist in Iran, but it is very, again, limited and very constrained by the authoritarian regime. So instead of a pluralistic society, you'll see in a lot of illiberal or authoritarian regimes, you'll have what's called a corporatist or corporatism that exists here. Now, a lot of people see like corporatism as um, like a business thing, and it's not really business. Okay, it's what a government does is it basically puts up a gate in your ability to have direct interactions with government. So you have the people here, and instead of there being legitimate labor unions or legitimate businesses or legitimate civil society, basically the state has put up a wall of your ability to talk to the executive or to talk to the legislative, and the executive is the primary driver of what's going on. And they tell these groups, hey, the decision making is here, but we're going to make it so anything that we don't like is going to be filtered through these state sanctioned, like almost government driven organizations. So the people don't have any direct influence in laws getting made. Everything's getting filtered through things like parastatals or state-run labor unions or like Chinese Communist Party looking over a lot of businesses and that kind of thing. So what the people do is they don't have the ability to participate directly because the corporatists, the state-sanctioned groups, the organizations are basically preventing this from happening. You see this a lot in Mexico, by the way, with like Pemex. You're not going to get into the government doesn't deal with the oil. Essentially, the state-sanctioned businesses, Pemex, creates the laws and prevents the people from having access to the government to help create legislation. Now, civil society more directly, we got to remember this is the single most missed theory in every AP comparative government, and it is on every exam save one, and that is last year's. Civil society is a group of people not a part of the state with a political agenda. Any group of people that is not a part of the state that has a political agenda at all. Okay. So, what happens here in civil society? Well, in a democracy, they're going to promote democratization. Authoritarians will actually use civil society as a way to, have register and monitor certain groups that exist out there to control them. In a democracy, civil society monitors and lobbies the government for change. Authoritarians instead co opt those groups, engage in corporatism to prevent groups access to the authoritarian government. In a democracy, civil society is going to actually expose government wrongdoing. Authoritarians will actually censor the media and actually reduce transparency to specific organizations, not allowing them to have access to what's going on. Um, in a democracy, civil society is going to represent the interests of members. So you have like interest groups that are out there, groups like the Sierra Club or the AARP or the California Chamber of Commerce, different groups that represent certain interests that can lobby the government. Authoritarians are going to limit any kind of protest, any kind of political parties, any kind of interest groups, and just to satisfy the will and the authority of the authoritarian. And understand there is a huge correlation between basic freedoms, civil liberties, and civil society. You have the right, the freedom of assembly, the right to protest, the right to free speech, the right to address the government for redress of grievances. Then civil society is going to thrive. You're going to have groups and organizations out there pushing for change in government. Okay. Some examples of civil society are non-governmental organizations, NGOs around the world. You name it, they represent all kinds of different groups. That would be civil society. Obviously, religious groups have a significant political agenda. You could say no, they don't. But if you've ever sat in a sermon, either at temple or a mosque or a church, there is all kinds of politics that is built up into religion, and they're always trying to influence some kind of political change to benefit them. Any kind of neighborhood organizations, whether it's like Neighborhood Watch, um, organizations for like home ownership groups, HOAs that set rules for how your community is going to look. These are, I mean, they're small level civil society, but they are politics. Obviously, news media that, obviously we like more non-biased news media, but there's way more biased news media out there, and they're trying to expose certain segments and what they choose to report on that influences politics. Business and professional organizations, things like labor unions, the American Heart Association, American Academy of Neurology, all these kinds of different groups that represent certain kinds of jobs. Okay. And so in the end, the political participation exists everywhere, and there are some things in common. Remember, elections do exist, they're just not free and fair in authoritarian regimes, even referenda. Remember the Russian referendum in 2020, protests, personal contact, organizations. Um, but in democratic regimes, much less restrictive, um, very voluntary, and your voices actually are heard and often matter. In authoritarian regimes, exact opposite. You're not going to get very many places when you're dealing with authoritarian regimes.